Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are undertaking what feels like a very expensive postmortem. We're looking at what many of our sources now call the single greatest creative and, frankly, financial disappointment of the entire streaming era.
It's a big claim, but the numbers might just back it up.
So yeah, strap in for a very turbulent ride through the high fantasy streaming wars.
Well, if the last decade, after the Game of Thrones finale was supposed to be this golden age for complex, long-form epic fantasy.
Right.
Then our subject today is really the poster child for how that golden age wasn't just tarnished, but, it was permanently starved and so expensively.
That's precisely it. That whole post-Game of Thrones era, starting around 2019, it was defined by studios and streaming giants just throwing what the sources all call ridiculous money at these big IPs.
Oh, yeah. A blank check for anything that looked like it could be the next Westeros.
Totally. We saw these massive financial billion-dollar valuations on properties like Conan, Amazon's The Wheel of Time, their Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power.
And even smaller sort of ambitious projects like Willow and the Return of the Dark Crystal.
There was this massive competitive urge, and the streaming services genuinely thought they had money to burn in the race for the next big global hit.
And the tragic irony, according to all the fan and critical sources we've looked at, is that burning money is exactly what happened.
Which brings us to our folk, Netflix's The Witcher.
Right. Despite an initially successful run, and I mean really successful, fueled by a perfect casting choice, the series is now broadly seen as an epic failure.
But you really have to look at the scale of the financial hole here to really appreciate the disaster.
It's staggering.
It really is. The financial commitment alone makes you just gasp. We're not talking about a failed indie movie here. Netflix has allegedly spent roughly $750 million on the show to date.
Wow.
And that figure includes production, salaries, marketing, and this is the staggering fact. Netflix committed $250 million, $250 million, specifically for seasons 4 and 5.
And this was after all the problems became public knowledge.
Long after the creative issues and the star's departure were completely undeniable public.
So that creates our central mission here, and the question we have to answer for you, the listener.
Mm-hmm.
How does a show based on wildly popular books and games, starting with a massive budget and a fan-favorite lead who was, personally invested, how does it bypass the opportunity to just print money?
And instead, allegedly, go straight to burning it.
Exactly.
We've meticulously examined sources detailing all of it. The specific creative clashes, allegations of deep disrespect for the source material from the writing staff.
And the measurable data points, the hard numbers.
Yeah, the screen time statistics, the viewership crashes, all the things that quantify this unprecedented financial and creative flop. A flop which really shook Netflix's entire fantasy.
Okay, so let's unpack the anatomy of this failure. Let's start at the beginning, at that moment when everyone really thought they had a guaranteed hit. The initial excitement was enormous, especially us. Now, while the franchise came from Polish author Andrzej Kolowski's book, The Witcher's rise to, true global fame in America came from the CD Projekt Red videos,
which were huge.
Absolutely massive. So when Netflix announced the series, the anticipation was driven almost entirely by one single cast.
And what a decision it was. Casting Henry Cavill as Geralt of Rivia was seen as this perfect fan service masterstroke.
It was. The sources describe it as an active dream project for Cavill himself. He was a known, very vocal fan of both the books and the game.
For a fleeting moment, it really felt like the perfect storm. The right IP, the budget, the perfect talent. Especially considering Cavill's situation with Superman at the time. The sources say he got screwed over by Warner Brothers.
So he arrived ready.
He arrived ready to embody the role.
Exactly. He wasn't just some actor collecting a paycheck. He was a fan. And that authenticity was a huge part of the appeal for season 1's market.
But that honeymoon phase, it started to crack almost immediately. And the early skepticism had these controversial elements that, in hindsight, were just massive foreshadowing.
Yeah, you don't have to look very hard for the first sign.
Not at all. Even before the show premiered, you had that first reveal of Henry in costume as Geralt, which was, let's face it, a little visually underwhelming for a lot of fans.
A little.
But the real immediate controversy, the visual signal that production might be taking some liberties, was the Nilfgaardian armor.
Ah, yes, the ball sack armor.
The one and only.
The sources remind us that this costume design was just instantly universally mocked on the internet.
Oh, brutal.
It was visually distinct, to put it mildly. This wrinkled, strangely textured, and just generally chip-looking design that defied any kind of conventional fantasy.
It was the first visual sign that production quality, or at least the aesthetic fidelity, was just seriously off.
But beyond the goofy costumes, there was also that initial controversy over some of the cast, which some critics praised as additional, diverse, and incast.
But the fan critique sources, they framed this differently. They saw it as casting that just didn't feel reflective of the source material's, very specific European setting and its cultural grounding.
So that created an immediate tension, right? Were they making a show for the established fans who knew the lore inside and out, or were they making a show targeting, let's say, modern streaming sense?
And that tension brings us directly to the approach of the showrunner, Lauren Schmidt Hissrich.
Right. She was clearly aware that the American audience primarily knew Geralt from the visually stunning game. So back in 2020, she tried to justify her adaptation approach. She stated, and on the surface this sounds logical, that it didn't make sense to make an adaptation of an adaptation, meaning she was adapting the original Polish books, not CD Projekt Red's version.
Which is a fair enough distinction, but the core critique from the sources wasn't really about the starting point, whether it was books or games.
It was about the destination.
Exactly. She claimed this approach allowed them to tell the story in a different way, describing it as a third way to enjoy these same characters in the same world.
And the source criticism here is very, very pointed. They argue that this third way reasoning was Hissrich basically telling us what she was going to.
Which was?
Which was creating her own version of the witch, one that necessarily diverged from the established spirit and tone that made the whole IP beloved in the first place.
So it signaled a potential lack of reverence for the lore, that the lore was just a springboard, not the blueprint.
Precisely.
And yet, despite all these early red flags, the armor, the casting debate, the showrunner's philosophy, season one's reception, in terms of viewership, was a massive success for Netflix.
Huge. It benefited so heavily from that initial Cavill hype and, the novelty of a big-budget fantasy show. It was one of their most watched shows globally.
The popularity was undeniable, while critics debated if it was a fair comparison yet to the huge success of Game of Thrones. Netflix certainly thought they had their golden ticket.
And critically, the audience reaction was overwhelmingly positive, which led to that significant divergence. Season 1 had an 89% audience score on Rotten.
Way higher than the critic score.
Much higher.
And that 89% audience score is so crucial. It shows that despite some of the minor issues, the core fan base, the people who cared about the source material, they were willing to accept this show.
Why do you think that?
Primarily because they felt Cavill was fighting the good fight. And the general tone, especially the monster hunting, it just felt right. They were invested enough to forgive flaws like, Geralt spending the entire final episode of season 1 injured in the back of a horse cart, as the sources humorously put it.
But that 89%, that sets the absolute high watermark, because as we move into season 2, we start to see the beginning of the creative decisions that would just systematically alienate that exact same audience.
Yeah, that 89% high watermark is the yardstick. It's how we measure the whole decline.
And the creative disaster can be traced almost immediately after the success of season 1, where the showrunner's particular vision, as you called it, really began to take precedence over fidelity book.
The audience reception data, it just tells a story of catastrophic collapse. It is an undeniable downhill trajectory.
So that 89% audience score for season 1, it dipped nearly 50% for season 2. It plummeted to 56%.
A huge drop.
And critically, by the time season 3 arrived, the audience score dipped even further, down to a disastrous 22% on Rotten.
It dropped from nearly 90% positive down to just over 20%. That's practically unheard of for a high-budget franchise meant to anchor a whole streaming service.
It's not just criticism at that point.
No, it's a mass audience walkout. And this disaster was absolutely predictable because of the early, very specific warnings coming directly from the show's star.
Henry Cavill. He was so deeply invested in the material, and even before season 2 aired, he started signaling his concern.
Our sources reveal he was willing to commit to the proposed 7-season run that Hissrich had out.
Which is a huge commitment for an actor of his caliber.
Enormous. But his agreement came with very specific, non-negotiable conditions.
And those conditions speak directly to why it all failed. He said he would only continue if the showrunners would continue making high-quality programming.
And most importantly,
stay true to the vision of the author, Anja Sapkowski. This wasn't a demand for more money or a bigger trailer. It was a condition based entirely on creative.
And his concerns about the creative shift were so specific, and they proved to be prophetic. He noted that the showrunner had a particular vision that was intentionally moving away from Geralt's singular central perspective.
Which is how the first few books are structured.
Exactly. And it was moving toward an ensemble cast with a heavy shift toward a Ciri Yennefer perspective.
So he knew he was being sidelined. He even talked about having to find his place within that structure while trying to be as faithful to the source material as possible.
It's like he was leveraging his own deep knowledge, which he jokingly called his psychopathic lore loyalist nature, just to try and temper the changes. He was publicly signaling this struggle.
And this brings us to the alleged internal process, which are just key to understanding the failure. This is where it gets really...
Because it connects Cavill's internal fight directly to reports of deep-seated dissent and just outright disrespect for the source material inside the writer's room.
This information comes from a former Witcher writer, Beau DeMaio, who went public with these extraordinary claims.
What did he say?
DeMaio stated that the staff actively mocked the source material, both the original books and the hugely popular video. He claimed, in incredibly blunt language, that some writers were not fans or even actively disliked the books and games.
If you're adapting a beloved fantasy property, the first rule has to be to respect the world you're adapting.
You would think. The sources cite this internal contempt as the very definition of a recipe for disaster and bad morale. They claim it was the foundational reason for the show's creative failure.
It makes sense. If the people writing the adaptation despise the foundation, the product is inevitably going to be unfaithful, distorted, and just lack the necessary affection.
And the ultimate confirmation of this disconnect came from the source himself. The original author, Andrzej Sapkowski, allegedly weighed in on the adaptation process, or I should say, the lack of one.
Oh, good.
The source quotes him as saying, "Maybe I gave them some ideas, but they never listened. They never..."
Wow. So that completes the pattern. Overriding the star, overriding the fans, and overriding the original creator.
It creates a perfectly logical explanation for the audience walkout. If you're a passionate fan and you see Henry Cavill expressing concerns about lore fidelity, and then you hear credible allegations that the writers are actively mocking the books you love, that drop from 89% to not a...
No, it's a rational audience reaction to feeling disrespected.
And we have to connect this failure to the broader context of the streaming wars. The sources consistently argue this stems from a deliberate strategic, what they call the feminization of traditionally masculine intellectual property.
So even though the showrunner may have denied any overt political agenda at first,
the sources state that the systematic sidelining of Geralt later became an unquestionable case in point for The Witcher's creative shift.
all of this brewing dissent, the declining quality, it all just erupted into a public crisis in late 2022.
Right. And the most significant event, the one that truly signaled that the show was dead on arrival for much of the original audience,
was the announcement of Henry Cavill's departure, October 13th, 2022.
The sources really emphasized the tragedy that he allegedly walked away from what he had called his dream project because clearly those conditions he laid out for 7 seasons were not being met.
That was the point of no return.
The fan response was immediate, it was unified, and it was utterly furious. A Change.org petition launched almost...
And what was the demand?
It specifically demanded that Netflix keep Henry Cavill as The Witcher and replace the writers instead. It got a massive 279,123 signatures very quick and later grew to over 300.
So the fans are laying the blame squarely at the feet of the creative team.
No question. The source commentary on this overwhelming petition response is very direct. They call it the single most logical decision Netflix could have made to save the franchise.
But they chose the opposite route.
They kept the creative team and replaced the star.
And the timing was just incredibly unfortunate for Netflix's fantasy ambitions. This massive crisis hit right before the rollout of their big spin-off.
For The Witcher, Blood Origin, if the hope was that the prequel would somehow shift the conversation, they were sorely missed. It just became a focus point for all the pent-up frustration.
Blood Origin was a disaster of the highest order. Its reception was, to use the fan phrase from the sources, ratioed into oblivion.
Can you explain that term for our listeners?
Sure. It just means the negativity, the comments, the dislikes, the critical responses, it vastly outweighed any positive engagement. It just buried the whole conversation in hate.
And the numbers confirm this. It earned a shocking 13% audience score on Rotten Tomatoes.
13%.
And a 1.4 user score on Metacritic. The source material argues this puts it in the running for the worst fantasy of that year, right alongside other high-profile, critically panned failures like Willow.
And the fundamental problem with Blood Origin, it just mirrored the main series approach. Major lore changes that angered the existing audience.
The sources detail that the prequel featured a major change to series bloodline and just completely altered the establishment.
Including the story of the Wild Hunt.
Specifically, yeah. They took Eredin, the mighty and formidable king and leader of the Wild Hunt, a huge antagonist in the games and book, and, in the source's view, unnecessarily diminished.
They turned him into what the sources describe as a sad gay man looking for a new boyfriend.
This was seen by the critics as changing the core essence and power structure of a key lore element just to modernize the character.
And this type of creative liberty is viewed by the sources as part of that broader Hollywood trend, where the priority is often seen as fixing the original material.
Which frequently results in a situation where new plot elements are introduced just so, as the source puts it, a girl could do it first.
Stripping the original characters of their narrative weight.
And we have to emphasize the financial scale of this specific, poorly received spin-off. Blood Origin cost $78 million after tax credits. That's nearly $29 million per episode.
For a show that got a 13% audience score.
When you think that critically acclaimed, high-quality feature films are often made for less, it's just a catastrophic misallocation. It shows a fundamental misunderstanding of the audience.
So facing this dual crisis, losing their star, their prequel bomb, the showrunner, Lauren Schmidt Hissrich, she attempts to perform some damage control.
Right. She spoke out, trying to appeal to the good nature of the fans. She said she sympathized over Cavill's leave, acknowledging the betrayal.
But at the same time, she made a direct appeal to the fan base to stick with the TV series for season 3 and any future spinoff.
And the reasoning behind that appeal was the key source of more criticism. She argued that failing to keep watching would be to the detriment of the upcoming spin-off Blood Origin and future seasons of The Witcher main.
Oof.
The source interpretation of this was very hard. It was viewed as begging the audience to return and keep her platform alive, essentially holding the jobs of the rest of the cast and crew hostage going.
Even though the creative decisions were the very thing that drove away the star and the passionate fans.
The consistent conclusion from the sources is that the showrunner and the writers drove off both the star and the audience by actively showing contempt for the material they were paid to adapt.
As we move into season 3, which is based on the book A Time for Contempt, this was supposed to be Henry Cavill's final attempt to honor the character.
But the sources show it only served to solidify the core creative issues that ultimately drove him away.
And strategically, Netflix made that desperate marketing decision to split the season in half, part 1 and part 2, just to try and milk as much viewership from Cavill's final performances as they could.
A calculated delay tactic.
But the internal creative priority, they stayed exactly as Cavill had warned about back in season 2. The overall plot focus continued to emphasize Ciri, Yennefer, and their sidekick Geralt.
The central narrative kept revolving around Ciri being the girl who's the key to everything, which, while it's rooted in the later books, the show accelerated it to what the sources call a tired old trope that just sidelined the main character.
The sources also highlight specific plot decisions that completely undermine character development just for the sake of pace.
Like with Yennefer. She had severely betrayed both Geralt and Ciri in season 2. That's a huge narrative event that should require significant, complex redemption.
But in season 3,
Yennefer and Ciri's relationship quickly reconciled, and Geralt forgave Yennefer almost immediately. The sources argue the showrunners completely bypassed the necessary authentic redemption arc to fast-track them back to being a functional girl boss.
But the truly astounding part, the unassailable hard data that proves Cavill's unhappiness was justified and logistical, is the screen time statistics.
This is where the sheer irony of paying a megastar to lead your flagship show becomes just so evident.
Okay, let's break down Geralt's actual measured presence in his own show, The Witcher. In season 3, part 1, there's 5 episodes, a total runtime of 4 hours and 35 minutes. Geralt, Henry Cavill, was only on screen for 73 minutes and 24.8 seconds.
That is astonishing.
Henry Cavill, the titular Witcher, the global star holding the entire show together, occupied only 27.97% of the total screen time in the first half of his final season.
If you're paying a star like Cavill a reported $1 million an episode or more, that level of screen time is financially indefensible. And creatively, it's just inexplicable.
And part 2, the final 3 episodes, was even worse.
How much worse?
Out of a runtime of 2 hours, 30 minutes, and 31 seconds, Geralt had only 25 minutes and 3 seconds of screen time.
Wow.
That's a paltry 16.67% of the time. He was functionally a glorified supporting player in his own farewell arc.
He was entirely sidelined. The sources argue his role was basically relegated to being a babysitter for Ciri, or sent on these inane side quests that were either not in the books or just completely irrelevant to the main plot.
For instance, fighting a creature the sources describe as a fleshy girl bits monster that resembled male anatomy. It was just a clear distraction from the central political action.
And in his final episodes, during the critical Thanedd coup, where Geralt should have been front and center, he was injured and spent most of his time in the female utopia of Bros.
Being healed by hippie ladies, as the sources call them.
While Yennefer and the girl bosses handled the main political and physical act, he wasn't the heroic central figure. He was dependent and peripheral. He even had to be rescued by his new companion, Milva, during his climactic fight.
This dramatically diminished role is the clearest, most quantifiable proof of the showrunner's particular vision that Cavill had warned everyone about.
He wasn't the protagonist protagonist anymore.
No, he was a very expensive supporting character designed to facilitate the story series.
And this systemic weakening of the protagonist was coupled with just extremely poor writing. The sources specifically single out the structure of Season 3, Part 1, Episode 5, The Art of Illusion, for particular condemnation.
Oh, that episode. Described as the worst episode of the worst season. It was a complex, time-shifting mess.
It used multiple repeated scenes and dialogue, just shot from different angles or perspectives, structured specifically to confuse the audience about the events leading up to the Thained coup.
The sources compared this specific writing style to the Rian Johnson School of Dumb Filmmaking, meant to make you believe it's...
Right. For those unfamiliar, this refers to a style where unnecessary complexity is introduced to a simple plot through structural tricks. It's designed to make the audience feel rewarded when they finally figure out a twist that was, in fact, painfully obvious from the start.
Like revealing the traitor everyone already knew was the traitor.
Exactly. And beyond the structural issues, the overall production quality was failing. The sources noted that the costumes and sets had devolved, becoming indiscernible from other failing fantasy shows of that era, like Willow or Rings of Power.
And the CG was described as consistently laughably bad.
And the continuity issues with time and distance were so rampant it became difficult to even track where characters were or how long their journeys realistically took.
The message was loud and clear. Everything about the show's technical and creative quality was collapsing in direct parallel with the diminishing role of the star, who was literally the only thing holding the massive audience together.
So now we arrive at the full cost of this fail. While Forbes reported a total spend of $568 million,
we need to focus on that high-end source estimate of $750 million, which includes the money already committed to the final abbreviated season.
And the question remains, why? Why did Netflix commit $250 million to seasons 4 and 5 after the disaster of Season 3 was already playing out and after Cavill had walked?
The sources argue this is a classic example of the sunk cost fallacy. They had already invested so much into the infrastructure, the sets, the contractual obligations of the supporting cast, that pulling the plug became almost as expensive as continuing. It was cheaper to try and save face than to admit complete defeat.
Even if they knew the creative well was completely dry.
It's a remarkable financial paradox because despite industry claims that the gamble has paid off handsomely because of Netflix's self-reported metric of 1.2 billion hours viewed,
the sources swiftly counter that with the undeniable fact that viewership crashed rapidly within...
Season 3's premiere was down 15% from the Season 2 premiere, and by the time they reached Episode 5, just halfway through the final Cavill season, a shocking 60% of the audience was already gone.
60%. They were literally watching the main attraction leave in real time.
And this collapse is the environment into which Liam Hemsworth, the replacement Geralt, was launched.
An impossible situation.
Completely. The marketing strategy for Season 4 was viewed by the sources as desperate and even cruel. They allegedly threw Hemsworth under the bus with that infamous tweet reminding fans, yes, he's still Geralt in Season 3. Ouch.
So it positioned him as the inevitable inferior replacement before he even had a chance to start.
And the results were immediate and devastating. The sources report the Season 4 premiere viewership crashed again, with reports of a 50% decline from the previous season's already disastrous numbers.
It recorded the worst viewership count in franchise history and failed entirely to crack the #1 spot on the Netflix top.
The audience kept their promise to walk out.
And so the sources then detail the creative direction of Season 4, now fully under Hissrich control, which seemed to rely heavily on self-awareness and meta-commentary.
Almost as a way to hand-wave the massive recast.
The new season allegedly opened with an 8-minute sequence featuring reshot scenes with Hemsworth already in the role and a full meta trend.
For clarity, full meta here means the show was openly referencing its own production flaws and narrative change. The sequence featured an old man's story being corrected by a young girl, the character Nemu, who convinces herself she's central to the saga.
The source critique describes this as playing out like a parody. It was designed to essentially signal to the audience that the old version of Geralt's story, the lore-faithful version, was doing it wrong.
And that the new, ensemble, Siri-focused version was the superior narrative.
And Hemsworth's performance, given the imposter, was heavily critiqued. He was described as blandly competent, having zero presence and zero charisma.
The sources famously coined him the Temu Witch,
meaning a cheap knockoff imitation premium product, and looking like a parody stepped out of a can't believe it's not Butterchill.
And creatively, the feminization process accelerated. Yennefer's role was elevated to the status of the main protagonist.
She led the feminist Avenger, an alliance including Triss, Philippa, Fringilla, and others. The sources specifically note that the narrative focused heavily on her training them in hand-to-hand combat.
And to make room for this, the sources point out that Vesemir, a crucial character in the books, who is supposed to live far longer, is killed off in this process.
Just to make way for warrior Yennefer and her team to get the most prominent action scene, it completely altered the power dynamics and timeline.
One of the most significant and controversial creative changes, cited repeatedly in the sources as a major failure of fidelity, revolved around Ciri and the rats.
The gang of bandits she joins after.
In the book context, the rats were supposed to be dangerous, morally compromised bandits. Ciri's time with them was meant to be her spiritual low point, her descent into darkness where she committed genuinely dark acts.
But the show's version
of the rats was cast as a homogeneously diverse group that came off as what the sources called annoying Twitch stream, a superficial rebellion, not a true descent into dark.
And the leader, Missile, was described specifically as a black lesbian, and the group's dynamic was heavily.
The most shocking source claim relates to a major alteration of a key scene involving Ciri and Missile. Okay. The books contain a non-consensual act, an assault, which leads to a dark, complex, Stockholm Syndrome-esque relationship with Missile.
And the sources allege that the show altered this scene significantly, making the encounter consensual instead of non-consensual.
Why? What was the reasoning?
It was allegedly done to avoid depicting a diverse member of the alphabet assaulting any. So it effectively removed the complexity, the horror, and the moral degradation that was central to art.
Purely for what the sources argue were ideological optics.
It removed the narrative weight and consequence of Ciri's darkness, transforming a harrowing character arc into what the sources saw as a sanitized, modern...
Which leads to a moment of deeply satisfying irony for the fans. The show introduces Leo Bonhart, played by Charlton Copley, a notorious, brutal human bounty hunter who specializes in killing witches.
And Bonhart provides what the sources describe as the most satisfying scene of the entire series when he brutally hunts down and massacres all of the rats.
So the sources admit they were cheering, even though they recognize the narrative irony of celebrating when Ciri's companions were being brutally murdered.
Because the show had made them so unlikable and so unfaithful to their source material counterparts.
So if we synthesize all the evidence from our source, the screen time data, the writer's room claims, the budget, the audience crash, the core reason for the show's colossal failure seems to point back to one central overarching.
A fundamental contempt for the source material, which translated directly into contempt for the passion.
The overarching theme that emerges is this determined feminization and ideological reframing of a traditionally masculine IP, all done under the guise of finding a mythical modern audience.
And this strategic search for an audience that wasn't primarily interested resulted in the systematic alienation of the vast existing audience they already had.
And the result of chasing this modernity is that the sources claim The Witcher now looks creatively and aesthetically interchangeable with other expensive, struggling fantasy productions.
Wheel of Time, Willow, The Rings of Power.
All of them are described as failing due to similar approach, sacrificing fidelity for what the sources argue are ideological goals, making them all look exactly the same in their quest to be different.
And this failure just underscores the unique wisdom of Henry Cavill's principled stand. His insistence on fighting for faithfulness to the lore made him popular, not just because he looked the part, but specifically because, sources note, he had the fans back.
He served as the ultimate surrogate for the passionate audience within the production. Once he left, there was just absolutely no internal check on the creative direction.
And we're left with the ultimate financial paradox. Upwards of $750 million spent, including the $250 million committed to seasons that were dramatically abbreviated and then failed to attract.
All to produce a product that satisfied almost no one. Netflix chose to spend hundreds of millions more to manage the fallout and save face rather than course correct the creative staff.
And in a perverse twist of fate, the sources claim that despite all the failures, the show did achieve a bizarre form of unity. It united book fans, game fans, and the massive contingent of Henry Cavill fans hating and mocking the show.
A unifying creative failure. Massive investment, we've learned today, is not merely insufficient, but actively counterproductive if fidelity to the established world and respect for the audience's investment are sacrificed.
The cost of hiring for optics over creative qualification or expertise in the source material, as the sources allege, can indeed be hundreds of millions of dollars.
The source material is clear in its argument. The comprehensive failure of Netflix's The Witcher was entirely predictable and absolutely preventable.
Had they simply listened to the star, Henry Cavill, and the passionate fan base he represented, they could have printed money. Instead, they mislabeled those passionate fans as toxic to rationalize their own fundamental creative and organizational.
So we'll leave you with this final provocative thought. We often hear the critical claim that fan fiction is the worst thing to happen to storytelling in the last century. But what happens to professional high-budget storytelling, where hundreds of millions of dollars are on the line, when those productions actively choose to disregard the foundational rules, tone, and character arcs of their source material for what the sources argue are purely ideological?
Where does the audience go when the professional production delivers a product less faithful and arguably less compelling than the fan fiction it should be up?
That is something for you to mull or explore on your own as you survey the current landscape of streaming fantasy.
This has been The Deep Dive.
Catch you next time.